The house stood at the end of the street like a silent witness, its windows darkened and its walls cracked by the relentless desert sun. It seemed to lean toward the passerby, as if drawn by a force unseen, whispering an invitation too compelling to ignore. They called it La Casa de los Espíritus, a name spoken with reverence and fear in the narrow, winding streets of Ciudad Juárez. Rumors spread like wildfire in this city, flickering through the air like sparks, igniting the imagination of those who dared listen. Some said the house was cursed, a place where the dead lingered, refusing to move on. Others spoke of a family, once prosperous, now forgotten, their laughter silenced, their dreams buried beneath layers of dust and neglect. But everyone knew one thing: no one stayed there for long. But Manuel was not everyone. Young, curious, and burdened with the arrogance of disbelief, he found himself drawn to the house like a moth to a flame. He had heard the stories, of course, who hadn't? But he laughed them off, dismissing them as tales to frighten children and tourists. The house was empty, abandoned. There were no such things as ghosts. His friends dared him, taunted him, until he could not refuse. A single night, they said. One night in the Casa de los Espíritus, and he would prove them wrong. The front gate creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo across the street. Manuel hesitated for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, a strange chill running down his spine despite the warm night air. He swallowed hard, steeling himself against the rising tide of unease that threatened to overtake him. He stepped inside, the old iron gate slamming shut behind him with a sound that sent shivers through his bones. The garden, once lush and vibrant, was now a tangle of overgrown weeds and thorny bushes. The air smelled of decay and old earth, a scent that clung to his skin like a second layer. He moved forward, the gravel crunching under his boots, and reached the front door. It stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible within. With a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick, heavy, almost palpable, like walking through water. The floorboards creaked beneath his weight, and his flashlight cast long, wavering shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The room he entered was vast, the walls lined with dusty portraits whose eyes seemed to follow him, dark and accusing. He laughed nervously, the sound echoing around the empty room, swallowed up by the silence. He made his way deeper into the house, the flashlight beams sweeping across the floors and walls. There were signs of life here, but not recent, old, forgotten. A child's doll sat abandoned in a corner, its face cracked, one eye missing. A chair lay overturned, its fabric torn and frayed. The air was colder here, colder than it should have been, and he felt a prickle at the back of his neck, a sense that he was being watched. The stories said that those who stayed here heard voices, whispers in the dark, felt hands that brushed against them when no one was there. But Manuel shook his head, laughing softly at his own nerves. There was nothing here but dust and shadows. Yet, as he continued, the sense of unease grew, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. His breath came in short, shallow gasps, his skin prickling with goosebumps. He heard it then. A faint sound, barely there, like the soft rustle of fabric, the creak of a floorboard. He froze, the flashlight trembling in his hand, his eyes darting around the room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice louder than he intended, breaking the oppressive silence. No answer. Only the sound of his own breathing, too loud, too fast. He shook his head again, trying to dispel the fear that was creeping into his mind like a slow-moving fog. He turned to leave, to return to the relative safety of the front room, but as he did, a cold gust of wind blew past him, extinguishing his flashlight. Darkness enveloped him, thick and absolute. His breath caught in his throat, panic rising. He fumbled with the flashlight, desperate to turn it back on, but his hands were shaking too much, and the button wouldn't click. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, he heard it. A voice, soft and low, barely a whisper. It was a woman's voice, speaking in a language he did not recognize, the words lilting and strange, filled with a sorrow so deep it made his heart ache. He froze, his skin crawling, every instinct screaming at him to run, to leave this place and never return. The voice grew louder, closer, and he felt a chill pass through him, a sensation like icy fingers trailing down his spine. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and he could feel something behind him, a presence, something that should not be there. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror, and in the faint light coming through the window, he saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, a woman dressed in white, her face hidden beneath a veil. Her hands were outstretched, palms up, and her body was swaying gently, as if caught in some unseen wind. Her dress fluttered, though the air was still, and Manuel could feel a coldness radiating from her, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. He tried to speak, to ask who she was, but no words came. His mouth was dry, his throat tight. The woman moved closer, her steps silent, her form almost gliding across the floor. And then she stopped, just a few feet away, and lifted her head. Her eyes were dark, hollow, filled with a sadness that seemed to reach out and envelop him, pulling him into its depths. He felt a wave of dizziness, a sudden vertigo that made him sway on his feet. The room seemed to spin around him, the walls closing in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. The woman raised a hand, pointing directly at him, and the whispering began again, louder this time, urgent, desperate. He could not understand the words, but he could feel their meaning, feel the pain, the anger, the sorrow that filled them. He stumbled back, tripping over something unseen, and fell to the ground. The room went black, a deep, suffocating darkness that seemed to consume all light, all sound. He felt the cold hands reach for him, grasping, pulling him into the shadows. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, only a silent gasp of terror. And then everything went still. The darkness receded, the cold hands vanished, and he found himself lying on the floor, alone in the room. The woman was gone, the whispers silenced. His flashlight lay beside him, flickering weakly. He grabbed it, his hands still shaking, and pushed himself up. He did not dare look back as he ran, his footsteps pounding against the floor, the shadows chasing him, the air thick with the echo of those voices. He reached the front door and burst through it, into the cold night air, his heart racing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He did not stop running until he was far from the house, until the lights of the city were visible again, until he was sure that whatever had been in that house had not followed him. But even then, even as he tried to convince himself it had all been a trick of the mind, a figment of his imagination, he could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, carried on the wind. The house was cursed, they had said, and now he knew. Some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried in the darkness, forever unseen.